Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Breen, and today I'm taking a journey into the weeds of memory lane on a side quest to a thing called Usenet. Question 1, do you remember Usenet? And be honest, because you probably don't, or you're misremembering it. Question 2, even if you really do remember Usenet, did you use it? What the fuck is Usenet? Long and short of it is Usenet is what the internet was before the World Wide Web came into existence. Remember, the World Wide Web didn't exist before 1993. 1993. The internet has existed since 1969. So there was a good, give or take, 20 to 30 year period where the internet, as we know it, didn't exist. What we had in its place, or before the World Wide Web came along and revolutionized the internet, I should say, was this thing called message boards, is basically what Usenet was, bulletin boards. The way it worked is you didn't have a server, you didn't host a web server with a website or anything like that. The way it worked was you had a list. You subscribed to that list. And then whenever somebody would submit or publish a message to the bulletin board, it would basically send out the equivalent of, not technically, but the equivalent of a mass email that would go to everybody who subscribed to the list, and you would use your software, whatever it was, to download all the day's messages for whichever list you subscribed to. And then you could read the messages and reply, but it was not in real time. Somebody could post a message at 8 a.m. your local time, and then you could submit a reply 30 minutes later, and then the reply doesn't show up until an hour from now. Which means the person hasn't had a chance to... It might be 3 or 4 hours or more before you get a reply to your reply. So the way Usenet groups typically worked is you would have like a group, like a thread, and it would be based on a topic, whatever the topic was, and that was the topic of discussion. And you could post threads, discussion threads, kind of sort of similar to how web forums would be in the late 90s when those came into existence. The closest equivalent we have today is Reddit, which is a very distant relative of Usenet. Basically, it's the closest thing we have today that is left over from the Usenet days. Everything else from back then is gone. Those servers, those bulletin boards, those email groups, they're basically gone for all intents and purposes. I know it is still technically possible to host a Usenet bulletin board, and technically possible to still subscribe to and reply to one, but for all practical intents and purposes, they're gone. And the reason I can say that is because sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, Google bought up the entire Usenet infrastructure and repackaged it as Google Groups for a very short period of time, and then they basically shut it down. So it's like playing online Quake today. It is still technically possible if you know what you're doing, but how it was done back in the day, no, it isn't the same. It is a totally different experience today. Like I said, it is still technically possible, but it's like IRQ chat. Nobody fucking uses IRQ chat anymore. Nobody does. And I don't mean nobody as in literally not a single person, but I mean the number of people doing so is so statistically insignificant that it might as well be nobody. Yeah, there might be maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people in the entire world of 8 billion people that still do that. But you're not going to know who they are. Anyways, so what about my personal Usenet memories? Well, I'm not that old. I was born in 82. The World Wide Web came into existence in 93. So my first experience with the internet was the World Wide Web. You know, CompuServe specifically, and then AOL briefly, and then I went back to CompuServe, and then I got just a direct connection where I was able to download Netscape Navigator and didn't have to use AOL or CompuServe anymore, and I was able to explore the World Wide Web on my own. And then sometime in the early 2000s-ish era, I discovered the Google groups that had basically absorbed Usenet. Now, when I say Google bought Usenet, that's technically incorrect. There's no such thing as Usenet. It's not a thing. It's not a service or a computer or a kiosk or a terminal or a server that they could buy. It was basically a service that they kind of sort of bought. What they bought was, I guess, access to the service. So, the way the internet used to work, which it kind of sort of still does, but it's like layers upon layers upon layers of more complex than it was in the old days. But the way it used to work was you had your computer at home, and then your friend in Berlin had a computer, and in order for you to both, you did not direct connect to your friend in Berlin, which, by the way, you don't today either, even though it feels like it's a direct connection, because today it's instantaneous. It is not. The way it works is, you have these things, which are basically warehouses of servers, inside of college universities, originally, called nodes. Basically, you have, let's just take, I went to the University of Nebraska. Let's just take the University of Nebraska as an example. The way the internet worked originally, and kind of sort of still does today, but like I said, layers upon layers upon layers on top of this. But the way it works is, you have to connect your computer to one of the nodes, which means you call into the node, which is the network, and the node transmits your request to other nodes. That's the internet. Internet stands for interconnected network. It's, hundreds and hundreds of local area networks, LANs, all talking to each other simultaneously through the information superhighway. So if I wanted to send a Usenet message or an email to my friend in Berlin, first I had to have access to the net. How did you get access to the net? Well, you had to have a telecom provider, usually a phone company, offer you access. So what you had to do was, this was in the dial-up days, you had your modem set up to where it would dial a specific number, which was basically calling into your local AT&T, and then the computer at your local AT&T would answer the call, and then it would redirect your call to the closest node, which my case would be Boise State, because I live closer to Boise State than I think I live closer to Boise than I do Salt Lake City, but it would be either Boise or Salt Lake, and then it would send the request to the network, and then that computer would send the request ping-ponging through the different networks, network to network to network to network, until it got to the network that was closest to my friend in Berlin, and then their network would send it to their telecom, who would send it to their computer. Now, this happens at the snap of the fingers, lightning fast. Even back in the day, it happened lightning fast, even when we were on dial-up. But the transmission time for the message to go over the email, over the telephone lines to the various networks across the world to your friend's computer, there might have been a slight delay because of the transmission time. But basically, we'll say a few minutes later, your friend would get the email, type up their response, send it back, and a few minutes later you would get their response, so on and so forth. Or same thing if you posted in a Usenet message group. Now typically, back in the old days, the way it worked is you would wake up in the morning, download all your message threads, reply to everything, go about your day, go back and download all your replies at noon, and then respond to those, go back about your day, download the new messages in the evening, finish the day, and then wait till tomorrow to get responses. That was typically how it worked. Now, you could host your own private bulletin board server if you had the software and the technology and the hardware. But again, you still had to use the Usenet protocols or transmission one way or the other. Everything had to go through the networks. Usenet stands for user network, by the way, which is the precursor to the what we call internet, the interconnected networks, which is, preceded by the original ARPANET, which is a whole nother thing. So it's like one network on top of another network, on top of another network, on top of another network before we get to where we are today. Like I said, layer upon layer upon layer. Now today, we have Wi-Fi and satellite transmissions and fiber optic cables along the lines between here and there. Everything is instantaneous now. At least in terms of like emails and sending messages and responding to tweets and stuff like that, posting to Instagram and stuff like that. Now, depending on how much private bandwidth your ISP offers you from your home computer to the network, might determine how fast you can download or upload videos and music and stuff like that. But by and large, everything is near instantaneous today. What is left of Usenet is more or less a relic of like outdated tech that is just kind of sort of floating out there in the ether somewhere that you may or may not be able to access if you know what you're doing. Your average internet consumer doesn't even know Usenet does or did exist, let alone how to access it. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even know if it is still technically around. I assume that it's probably still out there in the ether, but I don't know if it's still operating or accessible in a functional format today. At least not to the general public, I would argue, or I would assume. There you go. That's all I remember about Usenet. Again, do you remember it? Do you remember it by way of Google Groups? Or do you remember it the old school way? And like I said, I am not a scientist or a technician or a historian. I'm not offering academic level information that you can use as a source for a term paper or nothing like that. I'm just telling you surface level, my basic understanding of how it works. Obviously, the actual technological nitty-gritty of how the TCP/IP protocols work is way more complicated than what I just described to you. And yes, I did take classes in college. I do know what TCP/IP is and how it works. At least, again, surface level, I have the bare understanding of how it works. And again, it's amazing that things are instantaneous today, considering we're still using TCP/IP today. The oldest part of the internet still in use.